On this channel, we've talked a lot about various organised criminals, whether it be the Razor Gangs of Glasgow giving you a warm welcome with a slash down your jaw, to the Nordic biker gangs literally blowing up prisons with rocket launchers. But one organised criminal group that everyone seems to have a massive interest in, including myself, is the Yakuza. A very mysterious and interesting group that has resulted in an absolutely banging video game series. Now, I'm sure we're all well aware of the Yakuza, the well-dressed gentlemen that regularly attend karaoke bars, along with dancing on Friday nights. Turns out the games are not that much different from real life. Well, maybe a little bit different. The Yakuza very much like to stay out of the public eye completely and leave everyone totally in the dark about their activities, even during times of conflict. But sometimes conflict has a nasty habit of spiralling out of control, and it becomes very hard to keep your secret group's activities secret when you are gunning down people in broad daylight. The bloodiest ever Yakuza conflict. The Yama Ichi War. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get into the video, it is in fact your boy, Raid Shadow Legends.
Professor Death Knight here with a lesson about Live Arena, the new PvP mode where you can fight against other players in real time. Sounds terrifying? Well, so's going to the dentist. You should still do it. Live Arena has a draft feature where you can pick and ban champions to fight for you. Teamwork! When you win matches, you'll get Live Arena crests towards unlocking special area bonuses, or so I hear. I'm too afraid to try any of this out. Alright class, any questions?
So, Death Knight, how do you feel about the banning of champions in the Live Arena?
I hate it. I wish everybody could play. Back in school, I would always get picked last. This is just like when someone pointed at me and said, "You can't even play and your bones look weird." But you know, rules are rules, so.
And what is your best battle strategy for the Live Arena?
Well, everyone thinks I'll go in fighting, but nobody expects my charm. My best strength is the gift of gab. So when they try to attack, I'll just be like, "Nice weather we're having, eh?" Nobody'll see it coming.
And what would your intro music be for the Live Arena?
It's gotta be upbeat, high tempo, like a song that really pumps up the jam, or one that gets you jiggy with it. Sorry, you know I'm like 1,000 years old, right? I hope you use this knowledge you've gained here today about Live Arena to head off and do battle. Live! Make this whole Dead Bones professor proud, folks. Class dismissed! Do we have a bell? Oh, we should totally get a bell.
Raid Call of the Arbiter is now in full swing. To celebrate this limited series, Raid is adding some of the new characters from the series as champions that you can play in-game. The first one is Artak, a mighty orc warlord who is going to be available to everyone for free. All you have to do is just log into Raid for 7 days between now and July the 24th. If you've seen episode 1 of Call of the Arbiter, you will definitely want this guy. And if you haven't seen it yet, then go and check it out. And remember to log in for 7 days to get Artak. I use him, he's actually quite good. And use my link in the description down below to download Raid for free on your phone or PC. And if you want a starting boost in Raid Shadow Legends, then hit the link down below or scan the QR code on the screen to get insane bonuses. We are talking the epic champion, Knight Errant of the Bannerlords faction, and other useful things. Once you are in the game and crushing your enemies, come and find me and join my clan under the name Count Dankula TV. So just hit my link in the description and I will see you on the battlefield. Remember everyone, don't forget to download Raid Shadow Legends and join my clan because there's no one in it and I'm very lonely. Now, before we get into the meat and potatoes, or should I say the pork and noodles of the war, we need to establish some good grounding and understanding of what the Yakuza are, and how such a major conflict like this could break out among several Yakuza families. And sorry to burst anyone's bubble, but as much as I would love to do an in-depth account of the full history of the Yakuza, we'll only be giving a rough background on the primary families, along with their traditions and almost superstitious practices. I would love to go a lot more in depth, but trust me, this video is going to be long enough. As with most crime syndicates, the Yakuza stemmed from humble beginnings. By humble, I mean being complete outcasts of society. They are one of the oldest, potentially even the oldest, continued crime syndicates in history, though that is debated. One thing that you can't debate is that their origins are very old, going all the way back to the samurai era. There isn't a definitive origin of the Yakuza, as with all groups, they slowly develop over time. Like, the Yakuza didn't just pop into existence one day. They slowly evolved over a long period. Before they were called the Yakuza, they were called something else, and before that they were called something else, and so on and so on. What we do know is the Yakuza's origins are believed to stem from Japanese gamblers and peddlers, the more looked down on individuals in society. Now, with the Yakuza, one thing that plays a massive part in their organisations is their status. Not just among their fellow gangsters, but also in society at large in general. I'm sure you could break down the timeline of the Yakuza and how their public perception has changed over time, especially in the 20th century. But the best way to visualise it is like this. Generally, when you think of the Yakuza, they are like a third party of authority in society. Almost vigilante-like, where these are the guys you go to when the police can't help. Whether it be protecting your favourite big titty anime character themed cafe to keeping foreign drug dealers out of the streets of Tokyo. And the Yakuza mostly don't chase out foreign drug dealers because they see them as competition. They chase them out because they are foreign. You get rid of them because you don't want competition. I get rid of them because I don't like foreigners. We are not the same. And generally, that is how the Yakuza used to operate. The idea of the Yakuza, and especially their mindset and traditions, stem from their very origins in the samurai period. So, along with the ideas of honour, pride, and protecting the vulnerable, those are all key aspects of their syndicates. But let's not get too romantical just yet. As you can imagine, over such a long period of history, the crime syndicate would see a lot of changes, especially moving forward into the modern period, which would popularise the image of the chivalrous Yakuza member, which we'll touch on more later. But for now, let's establish the 20th century Yakuza and how the Yakuza ended up in basically a mini civil war all across Japan. So, without going in too deep on the Yakuza lore, we will of course primarily focus on the main family involved in the conflict, who are still to this day the largest and most powerful Yakuza family in all of Japan. The Yamaguchi Gumi. The Yamaguchi Gumi, or Yamaguchi family, can find their roots in the early 1900s. But in the early beginnings of the family, they weren't much more than just another of the very, very many small-time Yakuza families. It wouldn't be until after World War II where they would truly start to grow into what we see today as the modern-day Yakuza. The Yakuza exploded in growth after World War II. This is because Japan was pretty chaotic after the war. There was military occupation, society was breaking down, and institutions and law and order were collapsing, which created a perfect fertile breeding ground for the Yakuza to really flourish. Chaos is a ladder, etc., etc. But one of the most important factors that led to this growth was the leadership of Kazuo Toaka. Just a year after the bombs were dropped, Kazuo would be appointed as the third Kamicho of the Yamaguchi family, at the age of just 33. The last Kamicho, Noboru Yamaguchi, would be a major influence on Kazuo, because at a young age, he was a struggling orphan until he met Noboru. We aren't sure if he was officially adopted by him or not, but in Kazuo's early years, he would be a street fighter under the influence of Noboru. A very handy skill to have for his future as a Yakuza member. Finally, leading the family himself. The Yamaguchi family at this time allegedly had ties to the local dock workers in Kobe, where Kazuo would later work at the Kawasaki shipyard. But this didn't work out because he ended up getting into a fight with his boss and he lost his job, which pushed him into the Yakuza lifestyle, which he seemed more than happy to do because he felt that the normal wagey way of living just wasn't for him. But his Yakuza career came to a pause in 1937, when Kazuo was imprisoned for murder. And he was in prison until 1943, which was the height of World War II. Why did he get released from a murder sentence so early? Well, one theory is Japan was running a little low on manpower, and it was pretty common for them to dip into the prisons to replenish the stock, as it were. So this could have been why he was released early, but we couldn't find out specifically. We aren't really sure what happened between then and his appointment to Kamicho, but what we do know is that Noboru died in 1942 while Kazuo was still in prison. So, after presumably being seen as the best fit for leadership, Kazuo would be appointed as the leader of the Yamaguchi family. This is where major things would change for the family, as Kazuo would turn the family from doing small-scale petty crimes to much bigger and much more profitable crimes. The current jobs that the family were doing were small things like breaking up strikes at the docks, small protection rackets, and other petty crimes, which would result in only a little bit of profit while still carrying very heavy prison sentences. Basically, high risk, low reward. This, of course, wasn't profitable at all, especially if all of your gang members end up in prison over small, tiny jobs that don't even have that much money in them in the first place. So instead, Kazuo looked at expanding the family. He encouraged the main members to have their own businesses and to even have their own sub-family within the Yamaguchi. Along with this, a proper family hierarchy would be set in place, with, of course, the Kamicho being at the very top, with several pyramid-style layers going downwards. A shit rolls downhill type of deal. With this much better system in place, the gang would explode in numbers and profit, partaking in both legitimate, semi-legitimate and illegal business, along with other standard crimes to boost the gang's profit. This included a variety of jobs. You see, all different types of Yakuza families will focus on different jobs depending on what area they're based in or what their members specialise in. But generally, there is a lot of crossover in their crimes. This can include anything from prostitution, protection rackets, weapon smuggling, extortion, and drug dealing, especially in amphetamines. It wasn't called the workers' drug for nothing. The Japs absolutely love their speed. But it is important to point out that a lot of Yakuza families hate drugs, and they actually have severe punishments for their members if they get involved in the drug trade. Other than this, they would also be deeply involved in sporting events like boxing, sumo wrestling, MMA, illegal gambling houses, clubs, love hotels, pachinko, you name it, the Yakuza probably had their hand in it. With that, the Yamaguchi family ruled over all other families with how effective they were at expansion, leading to their gang gaining members by the thousands, having literally over 10,000 full official members at their peak. And that's full-fledged members. That number doesn't include associates, who are always included with the modern statistics. Associates are people who work with or for the Yakuza, but they aren't actual full members of the Yakuza. So, from the 60s to the 80s, which were considered the golden age of the Yakuza, they were ruling the roost all across Japan. One police officer even described the Yamaguchi family as being like a department store, referring to the extremely diverse ways they had of gaining income and the vast array of products and services that they offered. The core of the Yamaguchi would be based in Kobe City, Shinohara Honmachi in Nada Ward. Although throughout the years there would be expansion all across the various prefectures in Japan, with good intention not to step too far into other Yakuza families' territories. They are gentlemen after all. With that in mind, let's give you an idea of how powerful and entwined the Yakuza were within Japan. For example, during the Anpo protests in the 60s, President Eisenhower would visit Japan, and the Japanese government obviously needed security for such a major and important visit. So they asked the Yakuza. The Japanese government asked the Yakuza to run security for a sitting US president. This was for a few reasons. First, of course, as the Yakuza had plenty of strong fighting men to run security. And second, the Yakuza have been closely tied with politics, especially with right-wing parties. Seriously, the Yakuza's connections with Japanese ultranationalism could be a whole video in and of itself. And lastly, the Yakuza had plenty of political ties throughout Japan, anywhere from the local police station down to the main parliament. And by ties, what I really mean is people that were taking bribes. So when you ask the Yakuza to provide security and there just might be some communists there, well, the Yakuza were more than happy to help out, especially since this would both protect Japan from communism as well as harden the Yakuza's stance within the politics of Japan. If you watched our video about the Yakuza porn star kamikaze pilot, yes, that was something that happened, it's a great video, you should go watch it, then you might remember the name Yoshio Kadama, who was a political fixer with strong ties to the Yakuza. He, of course, was the perfect middleman for arranging the security for Eisenhower's visit. So yeah, the Yakuza at this time in Japan had a lot of power, especially the Yamaguchi Gumi. Also, if you're wondering what the word is on the tail end of Yamaguchi, it basically just means family. You might hear me referring to other Yakuza families with the term Gumi, Kumi, Kai, or Ika. They all basically mean family or clan. So don't get too caught up in the semantics of it all. It was just for easy clarification in case you were wondering. Moving back to Kazuo, his reign would last for a very long time, even surviving an assassination attempt in 1978, where a member of the Mitsuda Gumi named Kiyoshi Narumi shot him during a limbo dance at a nightclub in Kyoto called the Bellamy. Yeah, the Yakuza like to dance and practice limbo. They also really fucking love karaoke. The Yakuza like to party. That's like the one thing that the Yakuza games didn't exaggerate. But back to the assassination. Thankfully for Kazuo, he survived even after being shot in the back of the neck with a pistol. He was quickly rushed to hospital in a bulletproof Cadillac. As for the assassin, well, he was found a few weeks later, dead near some woods in Kobe. I'm pretty sure we can all guess what happened there. Kazuo's nickname was Kuma, which means bear. I know what it sounds like, never mind. And this was apparently because during fights, he was known for trying to claw people's eyes out, which made a lot of people very scared of him and rather reluctant to question his leadership. But despite his ferocity, time comes for us all, and sadly in 1981, Kazuo would end up dying of a heart attack, leaving the family in a rather awkward state of affairs. Kazuo himself, the bear, or also titled as the Godfather of Godfathers, would have Yakuza bosses from all over Japan attending his funeral, with many musicians, politicians, and well-known people also in attendance due to his influence. I mean, this guy's hands stretched very wide in Japanese society at the time, with his own daughter even marrying Kitaro, the very well-known Japanese musician. Kazuo's death caused a lot of chaos within the Yamaguchi Gumi, and the police saw this as an opportunity. So they started arresting people left, right and centre. Hundreds of Yakuza members were arrested, and I mean literally hundreds. The police did this with the hope that handing out very heavy prison sentences right after the death of their beloved leader would completely demoralise the Yamaguchi Gumi and make them believe that their time had come and they should just pack up and shut down. And usually it would be that simple, but the Yamaguchi Gumi immediately set out on restoring order. And to do that, they just had to decide who would be in charge now. Well, usually the next person in charge would be whoever the old boss declared as next in line. The problem was the guy who was next in line was Kenichi Yamamoto, who was in prison. But since his release date wasn't too far off, the heads of the family simply decided to wait for his release and then put him in charge. Seems easy, doesn't it? Well, sadly, Kenichi barely lasted a year and ended up dying of liver disease in 1982. So the Yamaguchi Gumi were again without a leader and again fighting off chaos starting in the family. So that begs the question, who was next in line to run the Yamaguchi Gumi? Well, this was one of the very rare occurrences where a female was put in charge, just temporarily for the time being. The Yamaguchi placed Kazuo's wife Fumiko as the temporary leader of the family until she and 8 other high-level bosses could decide who would be the next leader. This would come down to 2 candidates, Hiroshi Yamamoto and Masahiro Takenaka. Both very different leaders running their own syndicates, they provided very different skill sets that the group of higher-ups would assess along with the guidance of Fumiko. Now, to be clear, although Fumiko was technically put in charge, she wasn't necessarily a Kamicho or Oyabun, both terms used for the overall leader of the family, or in simpler terms, the godfather. She was kind of like a temporary vice president where she could make important decisions, but only up to a certain point. As you can imagine, with most crime syndicates, they are male-dominated and usually have a male-only policy, with women taking care of certain other duties that the guys wouldn't really deal with. You see, unlike some other crime syndicates, the Yakuza have a very strict way of life, along with their own set of traditions, although these may all vary between the families. Similar to the mafia in the United States and Italy, these traditions date back very many years, with it also being entwined with their own local culture. Some of these traditions you may have already heard of, such as yubitsume, the act of cutting off one's own pinky finger or the tips of other fingers after disrespecting the oyabun, who takes the role not just as the head of the family, but also as a father figure to the lower-ranked Yakuza. The severed pinky or other parts of fingers would then be presented to the oyabun in a gift box, kinda like that scene in The Big Lebowski. This dates back centuries to the samurai period, where a similar practice was done in old gambling houses if someone couldn't pay their debt. It's also alleged to be an old samurai practice because the samurai were very skilled swordsmen, and if you are a swordsman, the pinky finger is very crucial in being able to use a sword effectively. So, if you didn't have your pinky, you became more dependent on your leader and fellow warriors in battle. That's why offering up your pinky finger was seen as a massive declaration of dedication to your leader and fellow warriors. Nowadays, though, it's seen as the closest thing a Yakuza can do to taking their own life, to show that they are truly sorry for their actions. This, you might think, isn't so common, and I'm sure in recent years the practice has decreased, but it was found that almost 50% of the known Yakuza in the 90s had practiced Yubitsumi. That was just the known members, so it was probably a lot more. So you might be thinking these guys are pretty hardcore when it comes to their loyalty and honour, which they definitely are. This usually comes down to their set of rules or way of life known as Ninkyo-do, like their own form of the Bushido Code. Like a samurai, they are supposed to be respectable and gentlemanlike. So, with that, there are certain things they can and can't do. There are some basics like don't rat out the family or talk to the police, no personal involvement with narcotics, never harm someone who is vulnerable, such as women or children, and also don't hold back your earnings from the family. But the thing is, certain Yakuza families may or may not partake in all or none of these rules, because over time the Yakuza is constantly changing, especially with their ethics. For example, around the 80s to 90s, more and more so-called Rambo Yakuza gangs were turning up, doing whatever the hell they liked without really having a code, being no different to the other foreign gangs within Japan. The Yakuza certainly are an interesting one when it comes to these ethics, and I would say that the majority of them still follow these codes and traditions. There's actually an old Yakuza saying to outline their discipline and their respect for the higher-ups. If the Oyabun says the passing crow is white, it's white. These sets of traditions and taboos set the Yakuza apart from other criminal syndicates that may not care as much for similar ethics. For example, the Yakuza take death very, very seriously. It's not a simple case of just saying, well, he's a bit of a pain, better just whack him like it's the Sopranos or something like that. That's where the whole redemption arc of cutting one's finger off comes into play. There are plenty more examples of proving yourself to be a Yakuza as to be a Yakuza. They say that you have to be ready to take someone's life along with your own. You know what the Japs are like with their honour and suicide. So in the Yakuza, if you're going to kill someone, you better have a good reason for doing so. But I did mention about the other ways of proving yourself as a Yakuza. Again, you've probably seen or heard that in Japan, they do not like tattoos. Like, at all. Even today, there is still a massive stigma around tattoos in Japan. Doesn't matter if you've got a pretty butterfly or a boomer type skull scenario going on, they just don't like them. And for good reason. The Yakuza candidates, after going through a rigorous and tedious amount of training to prove one's worth, will eventually have to get a tattoo, or in Japanese, an iruzumi. Compared to normal tattoos that are done with a machine, iruzumi are done by stick and poke, which takes a very, very long time, especially when you're getting your whole back covered. Imagine going to the tattooist for 8 hours a day for 2 weeks. Again, this is another way for the candidate to show, hey, I actually want to be a Yakuza, I'm not just fucking around. And also, of course, this roots out any undercover feds, since I don't think any undercover cop is dedicated enough to get his entire body painstakingly stick and poked. You're probably wondering how we know so much about the Yakuza. Well, it turns out that in Japan, being a part of the Yakuza isn't inherently illegal. These days it kind of is, but we'll touch on that later. The part that actually is illegal is when you actually commit crimes. Yakuza across Japan, especially in the 20th century, would openly show where their main clubhouse or headquarters was, along with full member lists and other administration details. Like, they would have a full sign on the building basically saying, "Welcome to your local Yakuza office," just telling everyone where they were. Think of it as a more formal way of having a biker gang clubhouse. Like, having a biker club itself isn't illegal, but committing crimes as a gang is. So how did they get away with this for so long? And trust me, this is relevant to the story, which, I know, hell of a tangent, we will get back to it soon, but compared to every other crime syndicate, the Yakuza were very open with their lifestyle, even to the authorities. Throughout Japan's modern era, the Yakuza and the law would work in an almost symbiotic relationship where they would feed off one another. Let's say the Yakuza gave the police some information on a foreign gang, and the cops, in return, might let one of the Yakuza's boys off the hook for something. That's just an example, since it would be very hard to get specific examples of the Japanese authorities helping criminals. Also, as for the "what happened to don't snitch" thing, well, if you're part of a foreign gang, the Yakuza don't care. If you're foreign, the code doesn't apply to you. Along with this, the Yakuza like to keep a good status within society, often helping out at charity events, clearing the streets. I mean, even when the earthquakes and tsunamis were hitting Japan, the first people on the scene were the Yakuza handing out supplies to people, generally keeping to the idea of the chivalrous samurai. I mean, they don't even refer to themselves as the Yakuza, but rather as Ninkyo Dantai, or chivalrous organizations, seeing themselves as protectors of their community when the law can't deal with it. For example, let's say you run a quiet little bar and some hooligans decide to step in and cause some shit. The Yakuza would deal with them. Or how about you're in downtown Tokyo and you notice that there are rampant Nigerian drug dealers all over the place. The Yakuza would get rid of them. Or, let's say you're getting some hassle from the Chinese dragons. Don't worry, the Yakuza has got your back. When I give those examples, there is some truth to them. As in, the Yakuza was, and still is, the main barrier keeping foreign gangs out of Japan. This can include the Korean mafia, the triads, the Nigerian mafia, and even Iranian drug dealers. This is why the Japanese government and the Japanese people are very reluctant to completely stamp out the Yakuza. Because if they do, then that creates a power vacuum. And whatever fills that vacuum will probably be a lot worse than the Yakuza. Of course, Japan controls crime a lot better compared to some other countries. And the reason for that is probably the Yakuza. But anyway, the Yakuza have been seen as those vigilantes who deal with the bad guys when the police can't. But of course, the Yakuza aren't all cherry blossoms and boba tea. They are still a crime syndicate. And they have committed some pretty atrocious crimes. Maybe not as bad compared to some other crime syndicates, but that's partially why they did so well in Japan, because they managed to maintain that perfect balance between fear and love. That was a hell of a tangent we just went on, didn't we? But at least it was an interesting one. I'm okay with massive tangents as long as they're interesting. But anyway, this video is about the Yama Ichi War, so let's get back to it. With the departing of the last potential leader, the Yamaguchi Gumi had to make the decision of who would be the next Kumicho. So, let's discuss the candidates. Firstly, there was Hiroshi Yamamoto, aged 58, who had a lot of success under his belt by providing a lot of good advice and assistance towards Yakuza businesses, along with successfully moving southward in Japan to the island of Kyushu. This expansion, of course, provided a lot of wealth to his local family, but his timid, non-confrontational nature wasn't favoured by the higher-ups, versus his main opponent, Masahisa Takenaka. Takenaka, out of the two, was the more aggressive type, and younger by a few years, being 50 at the time. Along with that, he was a long-time friend of Kazuo and his wife Fumiko. But with his aggression also came a big list of crimes that he had been charged with, including illegal gambling, tax evasion, based, battery, and very many other violent offences. And due to this very long rap sheet, if he ever got arrested for anything, it would likely result in a large sentence, which would be bad news for the Yamaguchi Gumi and probably result in them having to find yet another leader. So he was seen as a bit less professional compared to Hiroshi, who was seen as more intelligent and business-minded. But sadly, Hiroshi's intelligence wouldn't be enough, and after the vote, Fumiko and the higher-ups chose Takenaka as their new Kumicho in 1984, with almost 80 other families attending the ceremony. After the majority of the bosses disappeared in their fashionable Mercedes-Benzes, which were highly favoured cars of the Yakuza at the time, Fumiko asked Hiroshi to not have any hard feelings and to cooperate with Takenaka as his subordinate. Hiroshi refused. He was absolutely outraged by the decision, and he made this well known. This was not a smart thing to do. The seeds were sown. So, a few days later, Hiroshi held his own press conference. Yeah, the Yakuza used to hold press conferences. At this press conference, he underlined his opinions on the vote, and he said, and I quote, "I cannot agree to seeing Takenaka become the fourth head of the Yamaguchi Gumi. I told Mrs. Taoka that I regretfully could not accede to her request. That is my frank and final decision." This, of course, was the semi-intelligent way of handling things. Not long after this, Hiroshi, along with 18 other lieutenants from the Yamaguchi Gumi, met in one of Kobe's top restaurants and discussed the situation. And they all decided to split from the Yamaguchi Gumi and form their own family known as the Ichiwa Kai. All dressed in their new dark blue suits, they celebrated the occasion in a long ceremony known as Sakazuki, where each member would exchange sake as a symbol of being blood brothers. Remember, similar to the Italian mafia, this is a family after all, and they really do consider each other as brothers, bound by tradition and honour. After Hiroshi left, not only did he take away several key lieutenants from the Yamaguchi Gumi, but he also took an estimated 13,000 members and most of the Yamaguchi's arsenal, including a variety of firearms, leaving Takenaka and the Yamaguchi in a very vulnerable position. But of course, the Yamaguchi and Takenaka also had to have their own celebrations, and as a way to one-up the newly formed Ichiwa family, they held an even grander ceremony for Takenaka on Shikoku Island. Things were starting to heat up a little bit, with nothing popping off straight away. But the tensions were very high, and you know this wasn't going to be smooth since the Yamaguchi considered themselves as a militant force, almost akin to a paramilitary. And with how many weapons they still had, they almost were. Sure, they weren't on par with the amount of weapons some random rebels in Africa or South America might have, but for a country with some of the strictest gun control laws in the world, the amount of weapons that the Yamaguchi had was very considerable. And Hiroshi knew this. The next 6 months after the ceremonies, no shots were fired. But tensions would still be very high, with the Ichiwa family starting to lose ground to the Yamaguchi. This was mainly due to one tactic the Yamaguchi employed by luring the defecting members back with a variety of benefits. This included amnesty for the old members, along with added retirement pay and even upfront cash of roughly $40,000, which the Yamaguchi Gumi could easily afford because they were very wealthy. This proved to be very effective, with the Ichiwa family dropping to less than 3,000 men in a very short amount of time, with not a drop of blood spilled. Yet. This brings us to 1985, and with the Yamaguchi gaining ground over the Ichiwa, both in membership levels and areas of control, Hiroshi had to take drastic measures to teach the Yamaguchi a lesson to stop interfering with their business. In late January of that year, the Ichiwa family sent a squad of hitmen armed to the teeth to Osaka, where Takenaka's mistress's apartment was. You're not really a crime boss if you don't have a mistress. But anyway, meanwhile, in the apartment building, Takenaka and two of his best men were in an elevator. Then, when the doors opened, this happened. I know, I'm sorry. This is what actually happened. You might think, oh, what a badass and brutal scene from the Yakuza video games, but nope, that was based on a real event that actually happened. That was the assassination of Takenaka. And they put it in the fucking game. The doors opened and the hitmen opened fire, and Takenaka and his two men were instantly killed in a hail of bullets. And they put it in the fucking game. The first shots had now been fired, and they were quite the first shots since they killed the fourth Kumicho, the leader of the Yamaguchi, and he was killed by ex-members of the family no less. The war had now started, and it would spread across the various areas of Japan. Sadly, there wasn't the time for any ceremonies so swiftly after mourning the death of their recent Kumicho. There just simply wasn't enough time to go through the whole rigmarole of selecting a new leader. So, Kazuo Nakanishi was accepted as the temporary leader of the Yamaguchi until the war was seen through. So now the two families were officially at war. And This was a war. Over the month, the police would arrest over 90 Yakuza members, along with confiscating almost 50 handguns and rifles, including an M16 automatic rifle. Over time, various street fights and stabbings and shootouts would occur between the families, with there being over 36 Yakuza killed in over 200 shootings. It literally got so bad that the local newspapers would keep daily scorecards with the latest killings for each side. The Japanese seem to have a little bit of a history of doing that shit. Most of these killings would be done by what is called the Toko Taicho, or kamikaze squad leaders. These soldiers in the family are regarded as some of the most respected Yakuza, because they're not only taking other people's lives for the family, but also risking their own. And speaking of kamikazes, Hiroshi, the leader of the Ichiwa Kai, allegedly ended up having his home suicide car bombed by a soldier of the Yamaguchi Gumi. But he wasn't killed in the attack, and it's not clear if there was anybody else injured other than the bomber himself. Yeah, this war got so out of control so quickly that the Yakuza were doing suicide bombings. From there, the shootings would carry on, with the Yamaguchi getting sick of the ongoing war and hoping for a quick end to it. The issue with these battles and shootings and stabbings spilling out onto the streets was public opinion was very quickly turning against the Yakuza, and it was damaging their image as the chivalrous samurai. This, of course, wasn't good for business or the publicity of the families, or just it wasn't good for the Yakuza in general, so they had to come up with something drastic to bring the war to a quick end. In late 1985, the Yamaguchi Gumi would send two key representatives to Honolulu in Hawaii, which included Masahisa Takenaka's brother, Masashi, along with their financial controller, Hideyomi Oda. There, they would meet who they thought were members of the Italian mafia in the United States, when in fact it was feds. It was undercover feds who were recording the whole interaction. The Yamaguchi representatives were hoping to trade £52 of amphetamines and £12 of heroin, which had a street value of $56 million, in return for a variety of firearms, which included 3 rocket launchers, 5 machine guns, as well as up to 100 handguns. Their plan was to have one final, end of the movie, massive raid on the Ichiwa family and finally put this entire war to an end. But to top it all off, they also tried to hire the apparent Italian mafia to send a hitman out to Japan to assassinate Hiroshi, because none of the Yamaguchi members could get close to him. Sadly, as you can imagine, they were busted instantly and held in the United States awaiting trial. But thankfully for the Yamaguchi family, both of them would get off on all of the charges scot-free. Now, how the hell did they manage that? Well, wait until you hear this. The Yakuza claimed that they were in Hawaii to try and book the famous King of Pop, Michael Jackson, for a show over in Japan. And as we mentioned earlier, the Yakuza were strongly tied to the entertainment industry in Japan. So to anyone that wasn't paying attention, that does check out. What made the case against them even weaker, though, is that the key witness, who was apparently a pro wrestler who was also a long-time drug informant, was actually arrested for extortion during the trial. So, the combination of a compromised key witness, along with the witness admitting that they had discussed booking Michael Jackson with the Yakuza alongside all of the whacking and firearms deal stuff, which made the entire situation look like a form of entrapment. Along with this, the argument of them agreeing with what the feds were saying was based on the Japs saying hi, which mostly means yes in certain contexts. But a cross-cultural expert also highlighted that hi does not strictly mean yes, but can also be used as a form of confirming that you understand what someone is saying. Just like how in Scotland saying aye in a conversation doesn't strictly mean that you agree with or confirm with what is being said. You are just acknowledging what is being said. So yeah, because of all that, the case fell through. During late 1985, things would go quiet, as there would be a ceasefire brokered by another well-known neutral family known as the Inagawa Kai. So things would be relatively peaceful until a member of the Ichiwa Kai broke the ceasefire. This wasn't planned by the Ichiwa Kai, and to show respect for the ceasefire, the family member that broke the agreement had to commit yubitsumi. So his index finger was presented to the Inagawa Kai as an apology. So yeah, tensions were still very high, and the other Yakuza families were not happy with the war, especially the neutral Inagawa Kai, because their boss at the time, Susumu Ishii, tried to resolve the issues between the warring families. Why weren't they happy? Well, of course, with such a major war happening in a fairly quiet nation like Japan, it starts to drag attention in from both local and international authorities, which was especially heightened with the involvement of the US feds. But the peak of the war would hit in early 1986. The Ichiwa family had taken a lot of important people to their side at the beginning of the war. And included in those individuals was 36-year-old Hideo Shiragami, running various companies and having plans to expand to the northern Mariana Islands near Guam. Hideo brought a lot to the Ichiwa family. This wouldn't last long, however, as in February of that year, Hideo was found dead in the sea off Saipan, near a notable area pessimistically titled Banzai Cliff, where hundreds of Japanese people, including soldiers, women and children, decided to kill themselves rather than be captured by US soldiers in World War II. There, Hideo's body was found with his body covered in marks of clear torture, along with his ears, tongue and middle finger being cut off. Topped off with some crushed ribs and a bullet wound through the head. Yeah, it was pretty brutal. It's clear that this was a message to the Ichiwa family from the Yamaguchi, as well as an obvious warning about what would happen to defectors. But this murder was so brutal that even the Yamaguchi leadership thought that was a little bit much. And barely a week after the killing, an emergency meeting was held. The families finally announced that the war was ended, though the war wouldn't officially end until 1989. If you are wondering why, this was due to the Ichiwa family disbanding due to a lack of membership and general weakness of their family. This was mainly because the brutality of Hideo's murder made a lot of people kind of not want to join the Ichiwa. So, with dwindling membership in 1989, they just fizzled out. So, Hiroshi Yamamoto notified the Higashinada Ward Police that the family would be disbanded and retire their actions as Yakuza. And as for the Yamaguchi Gumi, although they had won the war, it was at a great cost, since plenty of their own men had either been killed or put in jail for very long sentences. So yeah, a very bleak win at best. The one thing I will say that surprised me is that Kazuo Nakanishi, even though he was only supposed to be a temporary leader of the Yamaguchi, had actually won the war. But despite that victory, he was still replaced as leader by Yoshinori Watanabe, also known as Mr. Gorilla. Oh, I love Japanese nicknames. Who came in as the 5th Kumicho. So you're probably thinking, is that it then? Just the war was just over, just like that. I mean, yeah. Say what you will about the Japanese, they're fucking efficient. The war, although not the bloodiest in the world, essentially it was just a weekend in Mexico, was still pretty influential on Japan and the Yakuza in their society. Having over 36 people killed, some very brutally killed, and hundreds more wounded in a war between organised crime families was just unheard of in Japan. This brought a lot of questions from the public and a lot of interest to the Yakuza both during and after the war, because people either thought, wow, the Yakuza are so cool, Desu, or they just weren't happy with the bloodshed and chaos that the Yakuza had brought to Japan. Not long after the war had ended in 1989, the Japanese authorities wouldn't forget this either. And in 1992, the anti-Boryokudan was put in place, which severely disrupted the activities of the Yakuza, especially publicly. The easy comparison for this law would be the RICO Act, which the United States brought in specifically to target the mafia and other organised crime families. Except the anti-Yakuza laws introduced in Japan were like the RICO Act on steroids. Since the Yama Ichi War, more and more really strict laws have been brought in to fight against the Yakuza, with each new law being even worse than the last. Young people from poor backgrounds were the biggest recruiting pool for the Yakuza. Poor children saw the expensive suits, the fancy cars, the cutie waifus, and the respect, and they wanted some of that, so they signed up. But with these new laws, if you are a Yakuza member, or even if you are just remotely connected to the Yakuza, so not even a member, just a vague associate, you are not allowed a bank account, you can't rent an apartment, you can't get finance for a car or for any other item, you can't even get a mobile phone contract. You essentially can't participate in society at all. This basically completely removed every incentive these young poor kids had for joining up. As a result, there are practically no young people joining the Yakuza anymore. And young blood was essential to the Yakuza, since the kids would be the ones doing all the dangerous grunt work and getting arrested, because in Japan, under 18s get very lenient sentences for very harsh crimes. Seriously, if under 18s commit murder in Japan, they do like 3-4 years in a reform school, not prison, reform school, and then they just get released, which made the younger guys perfect for carrying out hits. And once they got out of prison, they would climb the ladder in the Yakuza very quickly for their sacrifice and dedication. They would do it because it was a good career move that would only cost them about 2 or 4 years. This lenient system was used and abused very widely by the older Yakuza members, since if an older member was accused of a crime and he was looking at 10 years, they would get one of the younger members to confess to his crime, since they would only do a very short, lenient sentence. This whole taking the blame for an older member's crimes was actually part of the plot in Yakuza Like a Dragon. But without young guys to do the grunt work or take the blame, the older Yakuza members have to do it themselves. And when they get caught, they are handed massive prison sentences, which only dwindles the numbers of the Yakuza even further. You might ask, why don't the Yakuza just pay and cover the expenses of the younger members then? Well, the Yakuza as a whole are struggling financially, despite the fact that these guys own and operate shit tons of legitimate businesses and companies, and even own property and skyscrapers and shit all over Tokyo. The laws make it illegal to do business with them. They're legitimate businesses. It's even banned to do business with the Yakuza's legal businesses. On top of that, the Yakuza's legitimate businesses, and even their current leader, Kenichi Shinoda, have all been sanctioned by the United States, making it even harder for them to make money. So, no more younger members, it being a lot harder to make money, plus the Yamaguchi Gumi suffering another huge split in 2015 of a bunch of families all breaking off to go do their own thing, leaves the Yamaguchi Gumi with an estimated membership of just 3,800 people. For comparison, the Aryan Brotherhood, a gang that mostly exists just within prisons and is one of the smallest prison gangs in the United States, has about 5 times that many members. The laws are so strict that the Yakuza aren't even allowed to put their signs up on their clubhouses. The public reactions to the supposed death of the Yakuza have been very mixed. Some people liked having the Yakuza around because they were a big help in keeping communities safe, and they would offer help and assistance to people who were struggling. But some people also consider them as dangerous thugs due to the Yama Ichi War, or due to Yakuza bouncers beating unruly customers with bikes. By the way, I thought that hitting people with bikes was just a mechanic in the Yakuza games. No, it turns out that was an iconic thing that the Yakuza used to do. Going all the way back to the 80s, they would grab a nearby bike and just start thrashing a guy with it. They even still do it today, except it's against rival Nigerian gangs who don't have a love-hate thing going on. Everyone in Japan just hates them. Which is why Japanese people are very conflicted, because like I said before, whatever comes in to replace the Yakuza will probably be a lot worse. Another thing that did cause a lot of shit for the Yakuza and their image was the story of Junko Furuta. But I do have to defend the Yakuza here. The guys who did all of that shit were not Yakuza members. They were just pretending to be Yakuza members in order to scare her. The actual Yakuza had nothing to do with what happened to her. Also, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you're one of the lucky ones. Do not Google it. However, despite everything that I have just said about the death of the Yakuza, it might also not be true. Their death throes might be exaggerated to make it look like they are really over and done with, when in fact the rules changed, and so did they. They might have just gone completely underground like most other gangs and are making more money than ever from all kinds of different avenues that they never touched before. And this whole, no, I'm too weak stuff is just all smoke and mirrors to trick people into thinking that they're gone. There are arguments to be made to both love and hate the Yakuza. It's not as simple as, oh, I've played Yakuza 0, dame dane, Kiryu-chan! It's not... Sorry. It's not... I've been filming for a very long time, I'm starting to lose my mind. It's not as simple as that. The main argument for loving the Yakuza is that they are pretty unique in their ways, along with their main role of playing the good bad guys, where although they do bad shit, It's nowhere near on the same level as other criminal gangs. You know, the sort of idea of straightening out the common criminal into the gentleman-like gangster. All we know now is that the Yakuza are definitely still around, and are definitely changing from their old ways, taking a much more traditional crime syndicate method of operating more and more underground, with no cooperation with the authorities, no publicly visible clubhouses, and no press conferences, while tying all of that in with more legitimate businesses. With both the new anti-Yakuza laws and the eyes of international authorities, we probably won't ever see them involved in a war of this scale ever again. At least, I hope not. But one thing is for certain. The old Yakuza way is dead. What they will turn into, only time will tell.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody just subscribe!